What's going on, everybody? I'm Primalliquid, and I am the bringer of potentially terrible, catastrophic news, unfortunately. So it's been a really long time since I've actually made a video about the FF9 remake. You guys know I've covered tons and tons of the leaks, but the last few haven't really been amazing or anything like that. Well, now things are a little bit differently. I've seen some news from an interview with Naoki Yoshida, aka the director of Final Fantasy XIV, the director of Final Fantasy XVI, and so on and so forth. He's got tons and tons of titles, super cool guy, but either way, he's really high up at Square. Now, he's recently done an interview where this was actually brought up, and we're going to talk about a couple of things right now for the FF9 remake. So straight off the bat, let me give a little bit of context. Obviously, I've done plenty of videos over the previous 3 or 4 years regarding the FF9 remake. I stopped probably about a year ago, just so one, I could focus on the challenges, and two, because a lot of the new leaks and rumors that were coming out were kind of the same things we'd already heard, or they didn't really warrant a video. Because I don't want to be that guy who makes, 400 videos a year based on just tiny leaks that may or may not be true. I prefer just to wait for a bunch of information and then put them all together. This one, however, is different. This one's actually kind of important. So, let's talk about it, shall we? Now, first of all, this was a post that is posted to IGN, okay? This isn't really what we're going to be talking about, though. This post is entirely just taking one little bit of information from an entire interview with Naoki Yoshida. Now, if you want, I will link this IGN post in the description if you want to read through it as well. Or, you could just pause the video as we're going through it. That is entirely up to you. What we are going to be looking at, though, okay, is mostly the actual interview itself that Naoki Yoshida did with website si.com/videogames. I don't know, I've never really personally heard of them myself. But either way, this is the full interview. This will be linked down below in the description as well, okay? However, there's mainly two things that we're going to look at here. So, first of all, we have a little bit of information about Naoki Yoshida himself, his background, and so on and so forth. So, the interview starts off talking about his work on Final Fantasy XIV, and one of the first major questions asked, can you elaborate on why the Final Fantasy IX Easter eggs were in Final Fantasy XIV? Now, players of Final Fantasy XIV know there are tons and tons of Easter eggs and throwbacks to most of the previous FF games. It's nothing new, okay? However, the answer Naoki Yoshida gave is basically, when FF14 was originally released, so this is the original 1.0, it just didn't really have any throwbacks to previous games. It didn't really feel like a Final Fantasy, and he really took that feedback on board when he took over the project to make A Realm Reborn, aka the infamous relaunch. Now, he also added, I considered the long history the Final Fantasy franchise has, but I thought that the franchise itself is a little bit weak in the sense of fan service, and especially considering that this is a game that regardless of your age, your gender, your country, anyone can enjoy and play together. When I had that in mind, I thought I wanted to have one concept of Final Fantasy XIV being as a theme park for the franchise of sorts, and up until now, we had yet to really incorporate many elements of Final Fantasy IX. So that is the main reason we decided to incorporate more of the essence of Final Fantasy IX. Now, there's a big thing with this, okay? So, first of all, there were previous elements of Final Fantasy IX in 14. Not a lot, okay? Not a lot, but a couple very distinct nods. So, with him saying, that there weren't really any elements, that's fair enough, there were only a couple. However, okay, the amount of throwbacks they've included in FF9, the amount of references and so on and so forth, just completely drastically outweighs a lot of the other references. Yes, we have stuff like the Crystal Tower, the World of Darkness, and so on and so forth. Tons and tons of enemies. We got the Ivalice raids, yada yada yada. There are tons and tons of throwbacks in every expansion for FF14 related to previous FF titles. This could be, you know, like highlights of bosses, summons, aeons, whatever you want to say. You know, there's tons and tons and tons of throwbacks for a large majority of the Final Fantasy titles. However, okay, the latest expansion went completely overboard with the amount of FF9 references. So much so, okay, that we've gone from FF9 being sort of a little underrepresented in the game to essentially being the most represented, or at least very close to the most. So it's a very, very distinct difference from just a couple to so many, which to me, I don't know. The answer in particular seems like very much of a marketing team answer, if that makes sense. Now, I personally have had the privilege of sitting down to interview Naoki Yoshida himself. He's an absolutely great guy and definitely very easy to catch off guard with a nice little grape question. If you don't know what I'm talking about, seriously, go watch my interview with Naoki Yoshida that we did about Final Fantasy 16. It was tons and tons of fun. Some of the answers you could definitely tell he himself was giving. And then some of the answers were also very much so he couldn't really say anything. He had to follow sort of a scripted answer from marketing and so on and so forth, which is obviously a natural part when you have such a high position and you are, you know, doing press for a game release. There are obviously many hoops you have to jump through, okay? To me, though, this answer definitely comes across as one of those, okay, you are not allowed to talk about what you want with this answer. This is the answer you give moments. You know what I mean? But now let's talk about the second thing. And this is the big one, okay? This is the big one. This is where things really don't look very nice, okay? Now, this is also on the SI actual interview. However, if we change back over, I'm going to swap back over to the IGN post right now, as this basically cuts down this massive interview to just the part that we really want right this instant. So, the IGN post basically just goes through the entire interview, and it basically pulls out just one little snippet, okay? And that is, he basically talked about what the remake might look like, and he warns that it might not fit in just one game. So as we can see here, this is a direct quote. Of course, I do know there are requests for Final Fantasy 9 to be made. When you think about Final Fantasy 9, it's a game with huge volume, Yoshida says. When you think about all of that volume, I wonder if it's possible to remake that as a single title. Okay, now what this is basically hinting at is, if we are going to get an FF9 remake, will it be on one disc? Naoki Yoshida-san pretty much says no. Okay, now this is going to be where things get a little you know? So obviously with the Final Fantasy VII Remake, there is a lot of debate around that, whether it should have been 3 separate games or not. Now, we're not gonna talk about FF7, okay? We're not gonna talk about that. We've seen how that pans out, okay, kinda. We've got 2 out of the 3 games for that, as it is a trilogy. But we're gonna talk about Final Fantasy IX and if they could do it in one disc or not. Now, straight off the bat, okay, we have to look at multiple things here. We have to look at the size and scope of the world. We have to look at asset sizes, all the sizes for AMVs and cutscenes and so on and so forth, the music, the sound files for, you know, just general sound noises. You've got so much to consider, okay? And when you consider one disc, it does have a file limit. Obviously, we're talking about PlayStation 5, PC, the latest Xbox. I have no idea what the latest Xbox is. Knowing me, I'd say the Xbox One and it'd be wrong. I'm not an Xbox player, okay? So we are talking about the latest gen consoles. Now, with the latest gen consoles, the disc is often completely unneeded. 99.99% of the time, the disc is just a loader. aka you put the disc in, it downloads the rest of the game from the internet. That's why day one you always have 100 gig patches pretty much, and that's why if you look at Warzone from Call of Duty, you have the disc and then you have a nice 600 gigabyte download for it, because all it does is basically it's like a key. Okay, it unlocks the download for everything else. So we aren't really going to talk about disk size limits. Okay, what we're going to talk about specifically is the story aspect here. Now, when it comes to Final Fantasy IX, doing that over multiple games is drastically going to affect the flow of the story. The reason I say that is you have to look at the actual process of FF9, okay? You start off with a nice light-hearted play where you kidnap the princess. You end up in Evil Forest, and then it's just a story about escaping to Lindblum with the princess. You know, that is basically the first light-hearted part of the game. Obviously, if you are playing FF9, that entire section takes about 2 hours, okay? That entire section takes about 2 hours. But then once you get to Lindblum, you find out about the war. So then you go from this super light-hearted, not really any rush of a story, to, okay, things are really starting to heat up now. Obviously, Disc 1 ends with the fight with Beatrix, but the war's not over. You have to go to Clara and so on and so forth, which means there's no real particular part to end the first game. Now, I say there's no particular part because if you go from Alexandria to Lindblum, okay, that would basically be a bit of a cliffhanger ending. You know, you've got the war just starting. That would be a cliffhanger ending. But then obviously FF7 did do that with just Midgar. Whereas FF9, there's really not a lot to go on. You know, there's really not a lot that you could actually do to really pad out a game there. Yes, you could do what FF7 did and just make Alexandria this huge 15-hour experience. But how is that going to work? You know, it's like Zidane as a character is there as part of the play. He's not just in Alexandria, you know, he arrives as part of the play. They have a set 2-3 hour time limit, or however long the play is, to kidnap the princess. So straight off the bat, there's not a lot of padding you can really do there. Evil Forest could be made a bit bigger, you know, you could turn that into a 1.5 hour dungeon, sure. Same with Ice Cavern. You've got the world map between Evil Forest and Ice Cavern. Not really too much you could do there. And then you have Dali. Once you are done at Dali, you end up in Lindblum. So realistically, you can't make a game just between the start to Lindblum because there's nothing going on. Even if they added things, it would just naturally detract from the nice calm opening of FF9 before things really hit the fan. And obviously the emotional aspect of FF9 with the light-hearted story getting more and more serious is really, really important because that affects the character development. It shows you how these characters can go from a nice light-hearted situation and see it escalate slowly as the course goes on. So if you were to add in fracture points early on to drastically change up the story, give more tension, it's going to naturally throw off the FF9 story. But okay, let's move on a little bit further, shall we? Let's say they do it in a multiple part game. Where could they end the first part? So we've talked about Lindblum, we've talked about getting up to Beatrix. So what about with Clara? You know, maybe end the first game at Clara. Well, again, it sort of falls under the same system. The war is technically still going on. Queen Bron is still in possession of the Eidolon. She's still waging war everywhere. You've still not found Dagger. In fact, you learn in Clara that you need to go and save Dagger, aka the princess. So that also makes that a terrible point to end, which means the first natural endpoint really is after you rescue Dagger from Alexandria. So once you end up at Pinnacle Rocks, you do all that, maybe then you get back to Lindblum. So once you're back at Lindblum, but before you go to the outer continent, that would seem like a natural end to the game. So what would actually be in that section, you know. Obviously, you've got up to Lindblom at the start. You've got Chocobo Forest, you've got the Marsh, you've got Gizmaluk, you've got Clara, you've got Trino, and then you are back in Alexandria. Okay, so it's not super long, but it probably could be fleshed out into one disc. Would I like that? Absolutely not, because it's still going to ruin the pacing. It means you're just getting started on, you know, the story branching out. But if that is disc 1, okay, if that's disc 1, let's talk about the second game. What would that cover? So obviously, if we count the first game ending at Lindblom before going to the Outer Continent, that gives you Fossil Roof for game 2. It gives you the Outer Continent, so, you know, the Lifer Tree. Gives you Conde Peak, Black Mage Village, and that's it. Because you've got to think, like, after the Lifer Tree, you fight Soul Cage, you go back, you recruit a Marant, and then you're back to the Lifer Tree because the Queen has turned up to attack Kuja. That's the end of Disc 2 in the original FF9. So, not really an ideal situation. There is some tenseness there, but you can't really do that as a full game experience. You know, even if you try and bloat it, there's just not enough content there. So if we look at Disc 3 for the original, what actually happens on Disc 3? So on Disc 3, obviously, you start off with Dagger basically going back to be Queen of Alexandria. Zidane goes off to Trino for the card tournament. Then you're back to Alexandria and so on and so forth before everyone ends up in Lindblom because, you know, Alexandria got destroyed and Dagger becomes a mute. Now, that could be an interesting sequence, for sure. That could definitely be an interesting sequence. I don't necessarily think it's, again, still really possible to bloat. Obviously, you've got the card tournament. You're constantly between Alexandria and Trino. So, I don't necessarily think you could really bloat that. I still don't think between the Outer Continent and Alexandria's destruction, there's really enough content there for a full game. But at the same time, it kind of marks a turning point for Alexandria being destroyed. So I don't know. I feel like that could potentially be an endpoint, but I don't necessarily think it should be. And then after that, obviously, you go to Black Mage Village, you find out about Kuja's hideout, you do Oilvert, Desert Palace, Esto Garza, Mount Gulag, and so on and so forth. If we are looking at a general endpoint there, okay, if we're trying to look, let's look at this as a free game series again, you know, another trilogy. So if we're looking at an endpoint for Disc 2, then I think realistically it's probably going to have to be around about, I'd say, the end of Kuja's hideout. You know, so you do Oilvert with one of the teams, and then you do Kuja's hideout. But that, it seems again like a bad endpoint, you know, because the parties are split up, they're not together. But at the same time, if we move on a little bit further to say Mount Gulag, where we rescue Sid's wife, that could be a potential endpoint. But then you've just started to learn about Terra, Kuja's background, and I suppose in a sense you also haven't actually gone through to do anything for that. But then that would also mean, though, on the third game in the series, that you would then have to essentially just do Ibsen's Castle, the Shrine, although granted in a remake you'd probably do all 4 shrines and not just the Earth Shrine, and then you are obviously off to Terra. Now, Terra could be expanded upon. Obviously, in the original, we only really see Branbol and Pandemonium. In a remake, however, we could see a lot more. Terra could be greatly expanded upon, which, in my opinion, is an absolutely ideal situation, okay? It's an ideal situation. Terra definitely needs a lot more storytelling. It needs to be expanded upon. That is something I have been saying for years and years and years and years, even before the remake was ever, you know, a thing that people talked about. It's something I've always said. Terra needs more. We need more information on Terra. We need more exploration of Terra, and so on and so forth. And then obviously it's back to Black Mage Village and then to Memoria and the Crystal World. So thinking about how we've just explained, how we've just split the game up, essentially, I do think Disc 3 is probably the easiest they could expand upon, right? I do think Disc 3 is the easiest they could expand upon because of Terror. That is something that they could make absolutely huge, and I don't necessarily think anybody would have a problem with that. The issue of making this a 3-disc game comes from the early game, just because of the way the story is laid out. But again, that's my opinion, you know, that is my opinion on this interview from Naoki Yoshida. So what I want you guys to do, okay, what I want you guys to do is, obviously I'm going to link these links down below in the description, so make sure you read the full interviews and articles, but I want your opinion, okay? Do you want a trilogy again, or would you rather it be a single game? And okay, no matter where you fall on the trilogy or single game argument, let me ask you, if it was made into a trilogy, where do you think each disc would end? And do you think there would be enough content to warrant it ending there? But though, guys, that is going to be it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope it's really provoked some interesting thoughts. This is one of those things I really want to talk about down below in the comments. So definitely write me a big essay, because I'm going to read it all. Until next time, though, everybody, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.